Bienvenidos al siguiente seminario titulado Reimaginar la integración.
Welcome to this seminar called Regional Integration Reimagined. We have a video that we're going to be sharing with you.
Durante este seminario vamos a escuchar sobre las...
We're going to be talking about opportunities to strengthen the ties of integration amongst our countries. If you would like to ask questions, remember we will have a Q&A. You can submit your questions by using the QR code on the screen.
To strengthen and expand integration in our region. Remember that if you'd like to submit a question, you may do so using the QR code on screen. Ahora sí.
Now we do welcome Anabel Gonzalez. She is the Vice President for Countries and Regional Integration of the Inter-American Development Bank. So Anabel, please, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar, Regional Integration Reimagined. It is a pleasure to be here with you in Asunción today and to welcome everyone who is with us this afternoon. Regional integration for a very long time has been a key pillar for the growth and sustainable development of Latin America and the Caribbean. Our countries share borders, markets, resources, and also challenges. Many of the the problems we have, regulatory fragmentation, limited integration into regional value chains go across our borders. And since those challenges are regional in nature, solutions also need to be regional. We by working together, can expand our markets, better coordinate investment, lower costs, and also create shared benefits. Joint action would help avoid duplication, it builds complementarity, and also in that way we achieve things that cannot be achieved through isolated efforts. So the IDB last year strengthened its focus on regional integration, and that is being implemented through 4 regional programs. Amazonia Forever, One Caribbean, America at the Center, and Southern Connection, each one reflecting specific regional realities, but aiming at a shared objective, turning coordinated action into measurable development results. Today, I would like to focus on one key pillar of this broader agenda of integration, connectivity and infrastructure as enabling factors for competitiveness, productivity, and inclusive growth. Despite major efforts, Latin America and the Caribbean continue to be less integrated than other regions. Regional trade has stagnated around 15% of total exports for 20 years. Value chains in the region continue to be limited, Exports from the region incorporate only something like 5% of value added coming from other countries within the region. And trade in intermediate goods is shallow, and that shows that there are weak productive ties across borders. Infrastructure gaps are part of the reason for this. The region has more or less 188 square kilometers, or she corrects herself, kilometers of road for every 1,000 kilometers square, which is a fraction of the road infrastructure in more advanced economies. And only part of that road network is paved and accessible year round. Logistic costs continue to be high, and regulatory fragmentation continues to limit cross-border activity. So the question is not only how can we improve connectivity, but how can we make certain that better connectivity will be translated into greater productivity, greater competitiveness, more resilient value chains, and greater opportunities for businesses and individuals that are cross-border. So infrastructure is essential, but it's not enough alone. So a corridor with an efficient customs operation does not reduce cost. Energy interconnection without regulatory alignment isn't going to deepen markets. A digital network without interoperable standards is not going to make cross-border services possible. So we need to create capacity, institutions generate value. When infrastructure goes hand in hand with reforms that lower frontier costs and encourage logistics and trans-border coordination, economic and social benefits grow significantly. So that connection between physical infrastructure and institutional frameworks allows integration to support long-term growth. International organizations have a key role to play to support this agenda by aligning financing, sharing knowledge, and promoting a policy dialogue while coordinating amongst institutions. In a context where resources are constrained, working together across organizations is essential to maximize the impact and to effectively support countries. Consequently, for me, it is a pleasure to call on Susana Cordeiro Guerra, who is the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean region of the World Bank. I would ask her to share some initial thoughts with us, and this will act as a framework for this discussion. She is leading the work done by the World Bank with 31 countries, and she supervises a portfolio of 41 billion of operations underway. She brings great experience in terms of effectiveness of development and innovative financing. So, Susana, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Buenos días,
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Anabel, for your words.
partners, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and open this session on regional integration reimagined in Latin America. We gather today in a context where there's significant change globally, and with this change comes perhaps significant opportunity for the region. Over the past few years, the global trade order has been reconfigured. Global value chains have become more fragmented. Major producers have shifted production closer to final markets. And global trade in services has grown by 45% since 2019. At the same time, geopolitical patterns are changing as we speak, and thereby creating new opportunities to reshape existing arrangements. In this context of change, regions can benefit from securing a stronger interregional base of trade, production, and supply chains, as Anabel remarked. Stronger regional cooperation can help diversify markets, stabilize supply chains, reduce vulnerability to disruptions elsewhere, and provide a buffer when global conditions tighten. Global evidence does support this pattern. Regions with deeper integration are better equipped to withstand volatility and to leverage global markets for growth. Latin America's own experience illustrates this clearly. Countries such as Chile and Colombia during the recent war in Ukraine saw import prices from regional partners rise less sharply than prices from global suppliers, helping moderate inflationary pressures and cushion domestic economies. And yet, like Anabel said, intra-regional trade accounts for only 15% of trade in the region. Latin America and the Caribbean stands at this pivotal moment to deepen the productive linkages that can drive the region's next wave of growth. While the region's economies have long traded actively with the world, there remains significant untapped potentials to build stronger value chains within the region itself, particularly in sectors where lacks natural endowments, industrial capabilities, and demographic strengths are genuinely complementary. From critical minerals and clean energy in the Andean countries, to agri-food processing across the Southern Cone, to digital services and nearshoring in Central America and the Caribbean, the building blocks for regional and deeper regional integration are already in place. Bottom line, the region trades globally, but it does not yet trade deeply with itself. And to be clear, this outcome is not because of a lack of trade agreements. There are plenty of those. The region has negotiated numerous preferential trade agreements, but most have focused on tariff liberalization rather than deep integration, the kind that underpins regional value chains, such as deep institutional integration in Europe and value chain integration in East Asia. Many regional LAC agreements are shallow in scope. They suffer from implementation gaps and lack strong provisions on non-tariff barriers, such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical standards, services, and regulatory cooperation. The reality is that countries in the region have often signed deeper and more enforceable agreements with extra-regional partners as opposed with their neighbors. The result has been fragmentation as opposed to integration. But there is an important, and that's the point I want to underscore here today, there is an important, perhaps counterintuitive point in this discussion, which is that integration oftentimes does not begin at the border. A World Bank study finds that in LAC, some of the most consequential gaps in productivity and opportunity are more pronounced within countries themselves compared to between countries. This is especially the case between thriving metropolitan economies and lagging regions that remain poorly connected to markets, infrastructure, and global value chains. For instance, a farmer in the Peruvian highlands, a small manufacturer in Brazil's northeast, or a service provider in southern Mexico may be separated from economic opportunity not by international barriers, but by inadequate roads, basic infrastructure, unreliable logistics, limited broadband access, or weak linkages to larger firms. Closing these internal divides within countries, within borders, is not a separate agenda from regional integration. It is a prerequisite for it. Countries that cannot connect in their own territory cannot effectively, they will struggle to plug into regional and global value chains in a meaningful or inclusive way. So the region is at a critical juncture. As changes in global trade and value chain patterns open large windows of opportunity. And with this, Latin America has strong fundamentals, abundant renewable energy, critical minerals, competitive agribusiness, proximity to major markets, and a growing pool of human capital. But seizing this opportunity to connect abroad, extra borders, requires a different playbook than what we have used in the past. And we would like to emphasize that doing business has to go about in a different way in two key dimensions. One is targeted investment in cross-border infrastructure, as Anabel rightly emphasized, which includes transport and logistic corridors, energy interconnections, and digital connectivity more broadly. But it also requires closer public-private collaboration aimed at a more inclusive productivity domestically, to support the sectors that speak to each country's comparative advantage, going back to the basics within countries so that countries can connect internally is the first step. And we can go in tandem as well to secure integration cross borders. And regional agreements are also in need to become deeper, more enforceable, and more operational. Less aspirations and more pragmatic realism. And this implies a deliberate process of strengthening integration mechanisms over time, setting clear regional standards and mutual reliance accountability frameworks, for instance, to meet the necessary standards for agricultural goods and technical standards for industrial goods, regulatory convergence across numerous sectors. Services, including those that are digitally delivered, are also central to the integration agenda. And to make this opportunity viable, several factors play a critical role, including regulatory frameworks, the quality of digital infrastructure, and the availability across border digital payments. Firms' capabilities, digital skills, and access to finance are also very important. Finally, informality is a constraint, and it cannot be overlooked, especially in Latin America. Large numbers of workers and firms operate in low productivity informal activities, which limits their ability to participate in regional or global value chains. So in this agenda, development finance institutions like the World Bank, the IDB, can play a very strong role in supporting the translation of regional integration into concrete commitments and operational implications. And this includes supporting cross-border infrastructure, advancing trade facilitation and regulatory convergence, and generating the analytical and knowledge work necessary to make informed policy decisions. The region stands at a critical juncture. The question before us is not whether integration matters. I think we're way past this question, but whether we can ascribe to this new playbook, a new playbook that involves working within countries, addressing and leveraging its basic comparative advantages across sectors for a more inclusive productivity agenda inside borders and working in tandem in a way to expand cross borders as well. Doing so, effectively going about the sequencing will require deeper regional integration agreements and policies, not just more agreements, a focus on enhancing regional value chains, and a commitment to services trade, not just merchandise trade, stronger institutions, and coordination, of which us multilateral institutions are willing to support countries as they make these choices to strengthen their institutions and accountability structures within borders, and hoping to expand trade cross borders in a sequential and pragmatic manner. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much to Anabel and to Susana. Up next is Dr. Frannie Leautier. She is CEO of Southbridge Investment. Please welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here in Paraguay, and I'd like to thank the IDB for inviting me to this session. For those of you who've been here since this morning, listening to the panels that came before this one, you would have observed that all of them mentioned the importance of infrastructure and the importance of regional integration. So I'm going to share with you a few thoughts and ideas on this topic. But let me begin with a small story. A few years ago, when I was traveling in this region, I came across a businessman, a logistics operator, who moves agricultural exports across multiple countries in this region. He told me something that stayed with me for many, many months. He said that the trucks that he used moved relatively quickly, including those that went to pick up produce from the rural areas, because the highway corridors were in very good shape. The infrastructure investment had worked. But when the trucks got to the border, they stopped, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Not because the road ends, but because the systems change. Different documentation, different inspection procedures, different digital platforms, and suddenly the efficiency created by hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure investment disappear at a single checkpoint. That moment captures the central challenge of regional integration. Roads connect geography, and we heard this morning Latin America is abundantly rich in road networks, but firms connect markets, and we heard from the private sector also earlier today. But at the end, it is systems that make integration possible. And that is the deeper challenge of regional integration today. So today I'd like to reflect on a question that sits at the heart of development strategy. How do regions actually become economically integrated? Infrastructure is usually discussed as a sector: roads, ports, energy networks, digital systems. But infrastructure is something much deeper. It is actually the foundation on which economic systems operate. It is a platform that allows regions to connect, to compete, and to prosper together. Yet, development experience teaches us an important lesson. Infrastructure alone does not deliver integration. Integration happens when infrastructure, regulations, and markets function together as a system. That systems perspective is what I'd like to explore today. Regional integration has long been an aspiration across Latin America and the Caribbean and many regions of the world. But when we examine the data and when we listen to the lived experiences of firms, of traders and logistics operators like the one I spoke to, we see that integration remains partial and uneven. Infrastructure investment has increased in many countries, yet connectivity alone has not always translated into competitiveness. The reason is simple. Integration is not created by assets alone. Integration emerges when economic systems align across borders. So the challenge before us is not simply building infrastructure. The challenge is moving from building assets to building integrated economic systems. So when I look at the infrastructure as a foundation for things to happen, it touches us in every dimension of our life. It determines how goods move, how electricity flows, how data travels, and how people access opportunity. In this sense, infrastructure is the closest economic neighbor to people and to the planet. But infrastructure has another critical function. When infrastructure connects systems, it enables integration. When infrastructure fragments systems, it limits economic transformation. The real challenge today is therefore to design infrastructure that connects systems across borders. One of the most consistent lessons from development experience is this: assets do not automatically generate outcomes. Connectivity does not automatically generate competitiveness. For example, a highway project in a highway corridor may move goods efficiently from one country to the other, but all that gets lost if the trucks spend hours at the border. The economic benefits can evaporate very quickly. In Latin America and looking at the Caribbean as well, export border compliance can take more than 55 hours. You compare this to 13 hours in OECD economies, or 8.5 hours if you look at a subset of economic integration across OECD. This means that even where infrastructure capacity exists, institutional friction remains high. Integration therefore requires systems to work together. So fundamentally, three systems need to work together. First, physical infrastructure to move the goods, the energy, the data. The regulatory frameworks, we've heard a lot about that this morning, the rule that governs trade, logistics, and investment, but also the market ecosystem, the firms, the investors, the logistics providers, and the digital platforms. When these systems align, integration becomes powerful. When they do not align, even infrastructure investments deliver limited value. So when do corridors fail? And maybe I'll just go very quickly now to talk about the most important aspect of integration, which is digital infrastructure. Increasingly, the invisible backbone of integration is digital. Digital systems now underpin customs procedures, logistics management, payment systems, and services trade. When customs documentation becomes digital and interoperable, border processing times can fall even up to 50%. Across Latin America, I was happy to see that paperless trade implementation has improved. It's now roughly 50%. So that's real progress, but it's also representing a significant opportunity. Because digital connectivity is not just an efficiency tool, it is also an enabler for rapidly expanding integration. It's a segment of the global economy that is growing very fast, and that is digitally deliverable services. So infrastructure as an asset. When we examine infrastructure investment, and you look at those patterns globally, you see an important trend. Regions that have achieved strong economic integration, particularly parts of Asia, they have sustained high infrastructure investment relative to GDP over very long periods of time. Latin America and the Caribbean have experienced lower investment intensity, and this has implications for infrastructure asset accumulation and competitiveness. But the challenge is not only how much infrastructure is built, it is how investments are coordinated across countries. Public and private investment are equally important. Infrastructure investment increasingly reflects a partnership between the public and the private sector, and private capital in particular. Private investment has been playing a major role in infrastructure globally, yet in many regions we see softness in both public and private investment levels. This suggests the constraint is not simply capital availability. Often, the real challenge is creating institutional platforms that allow capital to flow into infrastructure at scale. Another important dimension concerns intra-regional private investment. Regional investors historically have played a major role in sectors such as digital services and education. But their share of investment has declined in some sectors, and this suggests again an opportunity. Stronger regional integration could unlock greater cross-border investment within the region itself, and often it is the private sector that integrates markets more effectively. So why does this matter for integration? Infrastructure assets generate value only when they operate across systems and across borders. Private firms often see integration opportunities much earlier than governments. They build the supply chains, logistic networks, and digital platforms that naturally cross borders. The role of public policy, therefore, is to ensure that institutions keep pace with economic reality. Regulatory fragmentation remains one of the most significant barriers to integration. I know a lot of us are concerned these days about tariffs, but there's a much bigger and hidden tariff which comes from different standards, duplicative inspections, inconsistent procedures, and they act as a hidden tariff on economic activity. In some cases, these non-tariff barriers impose costs equivalent to several percentage points of tariffs. The encouraging news, however, is that many regulatory improvements are technically modest, but they are very powerful economically. Small regulatory adjustments can produce very large integration gains. In practice, firms are often the real agents of integration. Value chains follow efficiency, capital follows predictability, and scale emerges when risks are shared. Foreign direct investment flows across Latin America remain significant, but relative to the size of the regional economies, there is still significant room to deepen cross-border investments. Other regions offer useful lessons. Asia has emphasized scale and sequencing in infrastructure investment. Europe has pursued deep regulatory convergence, including being one of the conditions for joining the European Union. Africa is experimenting with corridor platforms and regional trade frameworks. The lesson is not that one model should be copied. The lesson is that integration requires intentional institutional design. So this brings me to the role of the multilateral development banks. Historically, MDBs like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank or the African Development Bank have been focused primarily on financing infrastructure projects, but their role is evolving. MDBs increasingly act as system integrators. They align infrastructure finance with regulatory reform, they de-risk cross-border investment platforms, and they convene governments, investors, and development partners. Often the convening power of these MDBs is maybe as important as their financing. And also powerful, as we've heard earlier, is the knowledge and ideas that MDBs platforms can deliver. Ultimately, integration does not happen automatically. It is designed. It requires moving beyond isolated projects towards platforms that connect infrastructure, regulation, and markets. It requires partnership with the private sector in building regional value chains, and it requires sustained cooperation across countries. When these elements align, integration can dramatically reduce trade costs and expand opportunity. Integration, in the end, is a policy, an institutional design choice. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion and to hearing your perspectives on how we can integrate across Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, Frannie. We now invite you to take a seat on stage. A continuación, vamos a dar
Now we're going to start with our panel, and to do that we're going to call on Ignacio Perez Arriaga, visiting professor at Sloan School of Management, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Ignacio, welcome. Round of applause, please. Alberto Trejos, who's the chairman of the board of directors of the Cuesta Moras Group. He's also former Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica. Demi Sinanan is the executive director, Caribbean Export Development Agency. Raul Valdez, director of logistics at ADM Paraguay. Jose Antonio Ardavin, who is the head of the Latin America and Caribbean division.
again as the moderator, Anabel Gonzalez. Anabel, the panel is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Y muchas gracias a todos.
And thank you to everyone in the audience, everyone who is with us. Thank you for joining us. I would like to give a special thanks to Frannie as well. Thank you for this very enriching presentation. One that focuses on a key idea for today's discussion, and that is that infrastructure alone does not generate integration. What really matters is how physical assets, how regulatory frameworks, and market institutions all work together as part of a system, and how the private sector responds when those conditions are in place. And so thank you, Frannie, very much once again for your presentation. I want to begin this panel by looking at Ignacio. In Latin America and the Caribbean, regional energy integration has followed different institutional paths. And we've seen with that different models in the region. The CIEPAC in Central America tends to be cited as one of the most advanced examples of regional EV markets, supranational institutions, a common regulatory framework, and also shared infrastructure. More recently, Andean countries, through the CINEA, have coordinated national investments and taken steps towards regulatory convergence. In the southern cone, in Sur, we've seen more progress in the area of bilateral integration and voluntary contribution. So, Ignacio, what do you think when you think about regulatory and institutional conditions? What is necessary to speed up the integration of energy markets? Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I think that it's no secret to anyone that Latin American countries have been pioneers globally when it comes to regulatory reforms that have led to the power markets that are now known throughout the world. I had an opportunity to be part of those development efforts in the 80s and 90s, last century, and that's where I learned about regulation. I was also part of the Central American market, and that was for almost 2 decades. And it's designed in a very particular way. It's pretty original. It makes it possible to maintain national sovereignty when it comes to generation expansion capacity and the use of generation resources and that economic dispatch mechanism within countries, but also being able to trade energy with the other countries in the region in a way to improve efficiency and also secure electricity supply. In South America, the challenge has a different face. Through a number of different studies, we've seen the benefits of greater integration of the power markets. However, the integration is based on infrastructures that do what they need to do in bilateral treaties. In some cases, you see coordination between countries, as we just heard mentioned. And that makes these interactions easier. But what we also see in these studies is that interconnection capacity that has been developed that could be developed further, but they are already sufficient, so they're being underutilized, in some cases significantly. And so in some way, this demonstrates that, as we heard from the story about the farmer who had to move product, doesn't really have to do with lacking infrastructure. It has mainly to do with the lack of the adequate set of rules in order to use them the best way. And so the problem has mainly to do with regulation. The challenges, or the challenge facing South American countries, is greater than what we see in Central America. And it is because the size of most of these countries, which allow them to have regulatory development, create internal markets, be self-sufficient, have economies of scale, that at the same time makes it more difficult or increases resistance to anyone wishing to give up sovereignty and have more shared rules and share resources. And so, in the absence of a Latin American government, the way that we can have an example of in Europe, that can actually have a way for applying rules to a set of countries that creates this situation. So how can this be addressed so that it can be greater integration and greater standardization? I think that the principles that have been used in Central America with respect to respecting sovereignty and facilitation, but also with a transmission infrastructure that has been designed from a regional perspective, those principles, by either streamlining or eliminating or changing the central nature of the governance, like what we see in Central America, where you can start thinking regionally about regulations and about some of the governance issues. It's possible to create integration, not necessarily from a regional organization, but from a set of common rules that are consensus-based. We talk about these rules, but they can be pretty simple. For example, standardizing transactions or standardizing settlement procedures for payments, how to address, say, deviations in a number of different ways, how to ensure payments. In looking at the system operators, making sure that there is clarity and an early understanding of the capacity found in these interconnections, for there to be protocols to address issues that could arise, maybe some supply shortages, finding ways to mitigate the impact of these incidents, and also come together when planning ways to strengthen the different components of the system. Also thinking about enhancing regulations and drawing from what exists in other parts of the world. How can all of this be made possible? I'll tell you a story. When I was a regulator, that's around 1995, 2000 in Spain, that is where the European Commission put forth a directive. And it basically said, you among countries can all engage, but no one defined the rules for that. So since nothing was happening, there was a group of regulators who all came together. We invited system operators, and in meetings that would be held biannually, we agreed on what the rules should be to define the internal electricity European market. And we told the regulators that they needed to enforce them, and they did. Sometime later, the European Commission, seeing the success of that initial effort, decided to formalize the rules as part of the regulations we now know. These regulations have been in place for close to 30 years, and regulators continue meeting to oversee market operations and also propose enhancements. This bottom-up regulation, this consensus-based regulation, is something that I think is simple in application. Thinking about regulators and the Latin American countries that I've learned so much from, that creativity that we saw some time ago can be used here again to define and set these rules. And that way they can increase and improve at a low cost the economic electrical integration of the countries. Thank you, Ignacio, for sharing your thoughts on electricity integration within countries. Alberto, turning over to you. Frannie talked about border frictions and how many times that can lead to higher costs than the physical distance itself. In Central America, with initiatives like the IDB program, American El Centro, the focus has been to modernize cross-border transactions, improving digital transactions, and also strengthening these interactions to improve that situation. So given your experience, how can deeper regional cooperation in terms of a trade facilitation, especially in border crossings help with trade and increase opportunities and competitiveness to help companies grow. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I think Central America is a really interesting case. The common market is very old. It's been around for a long time, well developed, zero tariffs. We have the same customs, regulations, and registry systems, the same health provisions. And in spite of that, what keeps trucks from driving at 40 kilometers per hour, but rather at 12, has to do with that stop at the border. That is the roadblock to trade. As economists and those of us who have been public policymakers, I am guilty of both, we tend to think about the aggregate impact. And so looking at this from a trade perspective, we can produce more, have more revenue, more income, more well-being, and more TFPs. But the business leader who's making these decisions, they're doing something that's a lot simpler. I can make this for 100. They sell that for 120. I want to sell it over there for 120. I need to buy this. Here I can pay for it 100. I can pay 100 for it. Over there I can pay 80. And so I need to think about all of that. And that is very different depending on the product. But you need to look at what is keeping you from earning that extra 20. In Latin America, for example, the tariffs were so high that it was the first thing to reduce. But we have made a lot of progress on that, maybe not at a regional level, maybe not all of Latin America, but at the sub-regional level, Central America, on the one hand, Mercosur, on the other hand, and of course there are other blocks. The lack of infrastructure could be what's keeping you from getting there. Slow processes can be the roadblock in Central America, for example. How slow the processes themselves are, those are the requirements that can be the major roadblock. So, as our folks say in our rural sectors, is that we need to look at what needs to be addressed in a given context. And so look at it by product and look at it by context. And so it's not only infrastructure, it's also us. We need to find that thing that's costing us more than 20, that's keeping me from selling this somewhere else and not earn that. Or also what is the confluence of those issues that is keeping me away from my 20 extra bucks. Some countries in the region have more integration. Central America, again, I think we have the best example. But there are some things that we have not made enough progress on. Now, look at this from the pros and cons side. If I take you to, blindfolded to a supermarket in Latin America, no brand and a number of other issues won't tell you what country you are in. You need to look at what the currency for given prices to get more information. But a region that has so much potential, so much that can be tapped into, and how it's connected to the world, it's still a region that doesn't know how to co-produce. Our participation in global value chains in Costa Rica, for example, we see it's further along. In the Dominican Republic, we also see a lot of progress. But that means that, yes, we're making the same commodities that we always have. We sell it to the world. We're not a market within our group because we make the same things. We have economies of scale. We have that massive consumption pattern. And we sell some of that amongst ourselves. But there are some parts between machines that between Mexico and the Dominican Republic will travel 10 times but never stop in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Nicaragua. And so for those of us who are part of that chain, we're not actually together. And that's where there's potentially value. But this set of processes and flows that we're talking about need to be made a lot easier for that to work. And the region just hasn't done enough work on that. I know that Jose and I did a lot of work so that a duty-free product or coming from a complex value chain that's coming from Mexico or from the United States on a ship can go through a 1-second process. What we still need to do is to get over that barrier that keeps us from producing together. How do we actually make things together? And I'll take it further. Only 15% of Latin American trade happens within Latin America. In some cases, that could be a lot, but in others, not so much. We are relatively similar economies in some ways. We offer the same things and we demand the same things. And I think that that means that we need to look at this on a product by product basis, industry by industry basis, country by country basis to figure out what is missing. It's not only reducing tariffs or having trade agreements. It's not only infrastructure. It's not only streamlining of these procedures. Sometimes these things go a lot further. They have to do with policies around production and not so much trade. And we can solve this by addressing them one by one. Thank you, Alberto. That actually makes me think of how important data is and evidence is to really inform those public policies, especially when we want to get to the granular level to be able to pass the right public policies given the case. Thank you very much.
Digital infrastructure is the invisible backbone of integration from trade and customs to payments, logistics, and data interoperability. In the Caribbean, where small market size, geographic fragmentation, and the absence of land borders shape economic outcomes, digital connectivity and institutional coordination become especially critical. So what does the Caribbean experience tell us about alternative pathways to integration through services, digital connectivity, or institutional coordination?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you to the IDB for having Caribbean Export Development Agency on this panel. It's certainly my pleasure to share the Caribbean experience. Just a bit of a context, I know mentioned some of the challenges that the Caribbean region face. The Caribbean region comprises mainly of islands, most of them are small island developing states, and we tend to look at the Caribbean as a monolith, but in fact it's 15 different disparate states, each exporting different things, each trading different things, each focusing on different avenues towards growth. So that essentially presents a number of challenges when it comes to regional integration. First of all is that being small island developing states, many of the islands lack scale. So we're talking majority of the business are micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, 80% of the businesses in the Caribbean region are micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So the level of scale required to trade cross borders tends to make it uncompetitive. Secondly, the geographic disparity that we face results in extremely high transportation costs. It is very expensive to move goods across the Caribbean region through shipping channels, mainly because it's a chicken and egg situation. There's a lack of shipping lines due to a lack of volume. So how do we balance those two challenges? Moving people across the region is extremely difficult as well. Some of the airline costs to fly from one island to another is extremely expensive. In fact, I would not doubt it was cheaper for me to fly from Barbados to Paraguay than it would have been to fly from Barbados to Jamaica. And of course, we have to mention the climate shocks and the environmental challenges that small islands face. All of these are extremely strong challenges towards regional integration. So the Caribbean has to look towards trade and services. Many of the islands are service-based economies, and services exports are really essential to their economic growth. And Caribbean Export Development Agency, we see services exports as a major pathway towards regional integration. In fact, I have the figures in front of me, if you bear with me. Exports of intra-regional exports of services are at $1.8 billion in 2023, while imports of services were $20.7 billion in 2024. So this really shows the importance that services has towards regional integration in the region. We heard a lot of discussion here on this panel, and I think the Caribbean, there's very much similarities to what's going on in the Caribbean region. If we are to promote digital services exports, we have to look towards digital platforms. We have to look towards efficiency. We have to look towards technology. We have to look towards institutional coordinations. And to do that, we have to ensure that there's adequate digital penetration across the Caribbean region. And unfortunately, digital penetration is very low in the Caribbean region. Many small and medium-sized enterprises do not take advantage of the opportunities that technology has given them. And you compound that with the fact that their policies and procedures to support digital penetration are inconsistent across the different islands. So where one island is much stronger in digital penetration and digital technologies, another island may not, which again presents that challenge towards digital integration. So what we have to do is really enact the policies and procedures that will allow for digital integration to filter down to small and medium-sized enterprises. We have to provide the adequate access to finance to ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises in the Caribbean region can access digital technologies and use those technologies to really facilitate cross-border trade and cross-border integration. I think it was mentioned on the panel a lot that institutional coordination is required. And we again need to ensure that we have the proper policies and procedures and technologies to really make that happen. Caribbean Export Development Agency, I just wanted to mention some of the, we're at the IDB general meetings. We are working very closely with the Inter-American Development Bank to facilitate digital penetration across the Caribbean region, primarily through our Caribbean Digital Transformation Institute. So as part of our regional public good with the IDB, we have developed a Caribbean Digital Transformation Institute that can work with service providers in the Caribbean region to really expand their digital penetration, and how can they use that knowledge to really facilitate cross-border trades and cross-border integration. We have to look at, we mentioned the customs. I think all of that goes without saying. If we have harmonized customs, harmonized procedures, and harmonized standards, that will allow for better trade across borders. And we have to really look at the transportation and logistics. How can we make transportation and logistics more competitive in the Caribbean region? And that would require scale. And I think, again, if we have that cross-border cooperation amongst firms in the region, that will allow for scale to rise and can bring down transportation and logistics costs. So I'll stop there right now. I look forward to answering any further questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Damien, for highlighting the importance of services trade as a digital pathway to integration and the challenges associated to realize that potential. Let me now turn to the role of international cooperation. Más allá de los
Beyond any domestic effort, deeper integration requires shared standards and multilateral partnerships that are stronger. From the perspective of the OECD, how can convergence towards OECD standards and best global practices strengthen regional integration even more in Latin America and the Caribbean? Jose Antonio, would you mind? Thank you very much, Anabel, and thank you to the IDB for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a great, fantastic panel. For those of us who already firmly believe in regional integration, I think that the moment we've been waiting for is almost here, and the moment that's gone through so many trying times. The OECD is trying to make a pitch for a future to reimagine integration, as we call this panel. And it's a future that's already starting to materialize in some way. The Latin American region is increasingly integrated within the OECD, and there are increasingly OECD standards found in Latin America. At the same time, the OECD is becoming increasingly more Latin American. And so this is something that we may not have thought about in the past, but throughout today's panel, what we have heard is that what we're missing are common rules, standards. So I think that these standards that the OECD has been increasingly proposing to the region are creating that regulatory standardization net or mesh, if you will, that's creating that important momentum that needs to be tapped into. And so how is the OECD supporting this process? I'd like to talk about two issues that they've been raised here, but one has to do with the lack of growth in the region. We all know this. IDB has raised this over and over again. The other issue that came up here is the lack of SMEs in the value chain. I think that we need to stop thinking about regional integration as a nice thing to have. It would be great to have it, but rather see it as an actual lever for growth and integration of SMEs, which ultimately results in growth. As we've heard a lot here, there's a big gap when it comes to infrastructure investment in the region. Some of it has to do with geographic reality in the region. This is probably one of the reasons we don't have that deep in integration, because with those distances, with the Amazon as one of our biggest assets, it's not easy now. It hasn't been easy before. And then look at the financial system. It has not been easy to finance that investment. We know that with the low rates, the IDB, CAF, and other development banks have provided a lot of support in the new kind of financing that exists today. But even with that, you still need the private sector for investment, and we still don't have a model for PPPs that are fully usable, actionable, that can help with that. And so that's the standard component there. The OECD has an international standard, for example, on public-private partnership best practices. When Peru was conducting its integration program, this was a country program with the OECD, it was undergoing a regulatory reform for its PPP regulation. And what did it do? It looked at the principles of best practices on OECD PPPs. And then they said, let's try to put that into our legislation. Right now, I think that there is a CAF phrase that was used. It says that Peru is the only non-OECD country with OECD standards in public-private partnerships. And that's where you start to see how, as countries come together more and more, we see that more and more, and how that is helping give investors what they want to see in Latin America. And so from Japan, we're talking about Japan in the last panel, in this case in the United States or in Europe, investors know that investing in California or in Florida, there are some regulatory differences, but ultimately it's all part of the same umbrella. In Europe, same thing. The problem is that those same investors show up to Latin America, and what they find is a diverse sea of regulations. And so I think that OECD standards is an issue that could help. And in some way, it's what we're already doing. We're doing that with the country program now, working with Paraguay, with Peru, Argentina, and Brazil, getting access to the OECD, the Dominican Republic, and Panama, and Ecuador. We've been cooperating and with each of these countries in some way in moving this process forward and adopting those standards. We're able to bring those regulations together and have shared regulations, which I think adds value. And one more thing where we're working specifically in Paraguay on, it's the corridors. And one of the biggest issues in these corridors is the border check-in. Having a truck that stops at a border checkpoint that costs tens of millions of dollars to the owner for every day it's stopped. We've had conversations on that. We've heard comments on that. And there are some companies that have decided to write off the truck because it has cargo that stopped for 2 or 3 weeks. At that point, they lose their cargo. The grains are fermenting, and so they rather write that off and move on to the next item. So I think that there's a lot of work to do there. The OECD is looking at different corridors right now, again, because you have the corridor from China to Turkey. You have the Transcaspio corridor, which goes through the Caspian Sea. You have the corridor in the Middle East through to Europe, the corridor in Africa. And now we're going to use the same approach to the Bioceanic corridor that goes through Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Chile. That is going to be a new paradigm when it comes to corridors and could really be the integration model for these kinds of corridors. I think that with the IDB and the OECD and other players working together, we can help we can help this model, and we've talked about this with other countries and other conversations, that there will be a need for implementing standards. There is an international standard, the TIO standard for road transportation, and just like all standards, there are strengths and weaknesses, but there's sometimes a lot of discussion here and in Mercosur on whether that treaty or that system is going to be compatible with the Syntac system that Mercosur mechanisms use. And so there's a complementarity between these mechanisms, and they can help everyone work together. One big advantage could be that if you have these three countries in the corridor that are already parties to the treaty, if the other countries also join, then they can all use one same digital document for one container that could travel from Sao Paulo all the way to Chile, and from there continue to Asia, or the other way around towards Europe or the US, ensuring that cargo from the very beginning. So we're working on that as well with the Bioceanic Corridor, so that the goal can go beyond just having a very efficient road. It can become a corridor that leads to economic growth. It's going to go through Chaco and Paraguay, which of course has some environmental and social considerations that need to be addressed, but all of that can be brought together as part of a development agenda that allows that corridor, for example, which also goes through the lithium triangle, that could be key in some of these new value chains that may be popping up in the region. For example, bringing lithium to the auto industry in Brazil or in Argentina, already well established, but where there's a need for local investment to make batteries, for example. All of that is possible. Not saying it's easy, it won't happen tomorrow, but to the extent that these regulatory standards can also all come together and be aligned, then investment can be attracted in a more harmonized way in the region that can lead to integration, and you can tap into those advantages from the corridor so that the region can be positioned at a key moment in the world, with the idea of the blocks that we see are increasingly important. And here, if everyone's playing on their own, then we're playing a losing game. And so now is the time for integration, insofar as the region can be seen as a whole, and we can start harmonizing our regulations. OECD rules are one potential basis, not the only one, but there's something there in common with most countries, and that could be a huge advantage for building that regional regulation framework.
Por tu reflexión sobre la importancia de los estándares.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for talking about international standards to support the integration of countries and attract investment. Turning now to the Southern Cone and the position of Paraguay within Mercosur, the EU-Mercosur agreement could be a transformation in terms of external integration of the region by lowering tariffs, establishing incentives through the corridor, and also by supporting logistics. At the IDB, we have done an analysis that leads us to think that the trade flowing can have important effects within that block. But in order to maximize those gains, there is going to be major dependence on dealing with historic restrictions in terms of infrastructure and connectivity. So, Raul, you, as part of ADM, what are the concrete advantages of that agreement for Paraguay? What are the needs for infrastructure, logistics, the regulatory framework that have to be addressed so as to realize the full potential? Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And as a Paraguayan, I just want to say I'm very happy that this annual meeting is being held here in Paraguay. And since we're close to lunchtime, please remember to have some of our beef, our meat. Now, you'll enjoy it. Now, Paraguay has some 7 million in population, and it produces food for more than hundreds of millions of people. That's our potential. And there is a strong grounding in soybean, maize, meat, biocombustibles, and we are net exporter. So within that context, the EU Mercosur agreement does open up an opportunity of giving access to markets. And that opportunity of accessing markets for a country like Paraguay and for the whole region, but specifically speaking of Paraguay, is an opportunity that would represent opportunities for investment in infrastructure and logistics and industries, but it has to be based on competitiveness. The challenge is competitiveness, and the possibility is access, but the challenge is competitiveness. And for a country that is landlocked, that depends on its neighbors in order to gain access to transshipment points to and from Asia and to the rest of the world, the key issue is integration. Integration as the pillar for competitiveness, so as to gain ties to one of the most rich areas of the world. For example, the central portion of South America is the breadbasket of the world. We are strong in livestock raising, also in agriculture. So we have to see how we can profit from that integration. And as we heard here and in previous panels, and I thought that the opening speech was great, that competitiveness that is based on integration goes far beyond infrastructure. That vision of saying we only need to invest in infrastructure, we do need to invest in infrastructure, but it's absurd to see our trucks waiting to cross borders. And that ruins our ability to compete in any marketplace. So that vision of having a regional coordination of aspects that can make our region more competitive all has to be based on intelligent, integration focused decisions. We need to have digital platforms that can talk to each other, and also we need to improve the whole infrastructure. 80% of our foreign trade in Paraguay is based on and the waterway between Paraguay and Paraná. So the fluvial system is so important for a landlocked country like Paraguay. The same applies to Bolivia, and they are part of the waterway too. Just to give you some context, the Paraguay Paraná waterway connects the central part of Central America, going from the port of Cáceres in Brazil all the way, it goes down from north to south. It goes through Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, which is where the agricultural pole, perhaps one of the most important one in the world, is found, and that is the area of El Rosario, and then it goes down to Palmira, Uruguay. So it connects 5 countries, and we are talking about physical integration in this case. It connects a block of 5 countries thanks to that waterway. But in addition to that, there is a regulatory mechanism that goes back to 1992 when Mercosur was created. In 1993, there was a treaty for the waterway, and it was signed by Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. And this is an intergovernmental, political, and technical body that regulates transit of passengers and goods along the waterway. Just to give you an idea, Paraguay, since 80% of its foreign trade depends on the use of the waterway, by moving 90% of river cargo by this way, it's no news, it's not a surprise that we also have the third largest fleet of barges in the world and also the highest number of river barges in the region. All of this as part of physical integration and a regulatory framework. So, what are the challenges that we face? Now, in addition to having a regulatory framework, there are tremendous challenges to be able to standardize the river police across 5 countries, documents, customs across 5 countries, and all of that is envisaged in the protocol for the waterway. But the coordination, the practical implementation have run into major challenges, even though there's a treaty that should regulate all of these factors. So, an important aspect, something that we need to improve upon, is regulation, and another aspect is the digital integration across systems. We still manage tons of paper for each shipment, for each barge. We're talking about millions of tons that come in and leave through the waterway. And that leads to a lot of bureaucratic paperwork that really adds no value. Now, I wanted to refer to what we are doing as an example of integration, as an example of work being done between the public and private sectors. This is an initiative with the support of IDB and Paraguay, and it is precisely to help us cope with those waterway challenges so as to better coordinate, better modernize all of the things having to do with the waterway. And we need to have a merchant marine uh, organization that would help with regulations, make regulations modern and practical. Now, this is a key example at a decisive juncture where we're talking about union or access to the European Union, where Paraguay is about to take this essential step. And this is thanks to work done in coordination between the public and private sectors with the support of the IDB. So that's what I could contribute regarding these challenges. And once again, thank you for inviting me. And I hope that we get some questions. Thank you, Raul. Thank you for those insights. Also, this really integrates Panama within the world.
In your keynote, you laid a compelling vision for regional integration. And throughout this discussion, we have heard from our panelists that the challenges, the opportunities of integration in practice across energy, transport, digital systems, and trade facilitation, and also how complex cross-border implementation can be. So based on your experience, what reflections would you share on the main challenges that continue to affect the design and execution of large-scale regional programs?
Well, thank you very much, Anabel, for the question. Maybe a few words in Spanish for me. Con más de 20 años sin práctica.
So I haven't practiced my Spanish for 20 years, so my fluency has suffered. So perhaps I will continue in English. Thank you, Fran.
Heart of why it is so difficult for countries to achieve regional integration. First, it is costly, and countries have budgetary constraints, so they have to program. And I think if you look at Asia, Asia succeeded in doing that because they did sequencing. So they had a long-term plan, and they sequenced the components of integration that were needed and made sure that every year the budget had those components so they could implement it over a long period of time. The second critical issue is to make sure that all countries have the capability to meet the common regulatory requirements, the standards, and all the procedures. And the example from Europe, I think, is quite critical because there was support for capacity building to help countries that were integrating into Europe to be able to meet those standards. And I think here the role of the IDB is absolutely critical. You've been doing that over the years, and it needs to be, I think, increased so that countries can harmoniously move in that direction. The third area is the ability to think ahead because of the massive changes that digitalization, AI, and automation is bringing. And here I think Alberto mentioned the product by product approach. I think if you can support the analysis of product flows, value chain flows, and pick the priority ones and give those the regulatory priority or implementation priority, that could help in the short term to minimize the budgetary strain, but at the same time move ahead. And then fourth, I think it's really critical for countries that can already start to pair up to do that without waiting for the whole region to do it. You see that in Africa, you find the East African community advancing very fast, the Western ECOWAS countries also doing the same, and then other regions are a little bit behind, like Northern Africa and Central Africa. So this gives an opportunity for the region to advance, even if not everybody is moving at the same pace. And then finally, I would say, I'm very impressed by what the private sector has been able to do, and Raul gave some very good examples on the logistics side. So giving the private sector the space to innovate and to move forward, and that would then help us do what we heard very clearly from the MIT voice on how these systems then can move forward collectively. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those reflections. La integración regional, clara.
Regional integration clearly requires a lot of elements to succeed. That's something our panelists have said. But before concluding, I would like to ask each of you, and I begin with Ignacio, please give us a final thought. Three words or a hashtag, but something having to do with a key priority to turn regional integration into concrete results, moving it from an ambition to something concrete. I would say two things instead of one. One is understanding how important regulation by consensus is. And the other, at least in the electrical power system, what we did in Europe, is what we called the single system paradigm. So to develop regulations as if the 27 countries in the European Union were a single country. So it's a single system paradigm. And you need to get as close to that as possible. Thank you, Ignacio. Alberto, two things. One, let's think not only about how we can integrate what each country is currently producing, let's think about what each country could potentially produce. And also, let's listen to the people out in the trenches, the people that are producing, the people that buy and sell, to know what the constraints are in each sector. Thank you, Dami.
Be committed to it, be realistic about it, and have a plan.
Very good, very clear. Raúl.
Raúl? Integration only becomes practical if it's translated into competitiveness. And consequently, it needs to be coordinated at the regional level so as to increase competitiveness. Also, I would call on the private sector. We need to involve business in solutions. Not only do we need them to raise problems, they need to bring forward ideas leading to solutions to solve these problems. Thank you. Great. Jose Antonio, I would say that integration is the I, and to reach the I, we have to begin with, in Spanish, A, harmonization. That is the challenge for the coming decades. We have to try to not reinvent the wheel. We in Latin America are very individualistic. We like to have our own solution, but we just heard here from the panel, there are a lot of networks. We're working with the IDB, for example. There are other places. We need consensus across Latin America so we can adapt international principles, adapting them to the needs of the region. So let's do that. Well, I wanted to emphasize implementation, 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 because I think that that is always tremendously important. Now, we do have some questions we got from the audience. We have been answering them here during the panel, having to do with processing with border crossing, also looking at reforms, things having to do with implementation capacity. So I think that our panelists did a great job. They really did get ahead of the questions that we received from the audience. With that, I wanted to thank our keynote speaker, Frannie. I wanted to thank Susana Cordeiro from the World Bank. And also, I wanted to thank the panelists for this rich discussion. And today's conversation stresses that regional integration is critical. We know that it can be a strong engine for growth, but it's not limited to infrastructure. It needs systems that work in coordination, crossing borders, institutions, and in the IDB, we have our commitment to support countries so as to translate implementation into results by aligning infrastructures, policies, and institutions to promote competitiveness, resilience, and inclusive growth. This brings us to the end of this seminar, and we thank you for your participation. We hope that today's conversation will help us continue to strengthen our regional integration agenda. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone, for this important discussion, and thank you, Anabel, for moderating. Despidamos con un fuerte aplauso a los.
So, a round of applause for our panelists. And this concludes our seminar about regional integration reimagined. We at 2:30 will inaugurate the business forum with the participation of investors and key players in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Of the Business Forum. Don't miss it. Nos vemos más tarde. Gracias.
We'll see you later. Thank you.
Join us in Paraguay on March 11 to 14 for our most important gathering, the IDB Group's annual meeting. Last year was the IDB Group's record year, with the highest ever level of $35 billion in financing, while strengthening the quality of our projects and processes and therefore delivering impact. This led